Imagine, if you will, a scene from the year 1607. On a swampy, unforgiving and disease-ridden riverbank in what would be called Virginia, a paltry group of 104 Englishmen are huddled together. They are emaciated figures, their bodies racked by fevers and fluxes, more than half-starved and teetering on the brink of utter despair. For their defense against a continent of unknown peoples and perils, they have a single, aging cannon. They possess absolutely no practical knowledge of how to farm this new alien land, whose soil and seasons are a complete mystery to them. To add to their misery, they are tormented relentlessly by mosquitoes the size of nickels. What you are witnessing is a portrait of imminent catastrophic failure, a tiny flickering candle of a colony lost in a vast, dark, and indifferent wilderness. Now let's fast forward 4 centuries. Picture the distant descendants of these beleaguered souls, floating weightlessly in the sterile microgravity environment of the International Space Station. They are sipping vacuum-sealed coffee from a pouch, gazing down through a triple-paned quartz window at the sprawling, illuminated continent their ancestors struggled merely to survive on. How on earth did that spectacular, that improbable, that world-altering jump from a malarial swamp to the vacuum of space actually happen? That is the Monumental Puzzle, the grand and sprawling epic that we are here to unpack today. This is the story of how that single, fragile, and desperate settlement on the James River somehow managed to evolve, against all conceivable odds, into a global heavyweight that would not only forge a new path, but would redefine the very concept of a nation for the entire world. We are not going to approach this epic with flashy graphics or a dizzying montage of quick cuts. This channel is dedicated to doing history justice. This is the full, unvarnished, and often brutally messy story, told properly, one crucial, complicated, and consequential chapter at a time. So go ahead, grab your favorite drink, find a comfortable chair, and prepare for the long haul. This is the story of America, and it's a story that deserves to be told in its entirety. The colony of Jamestown almost collapsed into a forgotten historical footnote, a ghost story whispered by mariners, before it even truly began. Those first few years were an unrelenting nightmare of famine, disease, and a constant, looming specter of death. During the horrifying winter of 1609 to 1610, a period so grim it would forever be known as the Starving Time, the desperate colonists were besieged by local Powhatan warriors, trapped within their own flimsy fort. They were reduced to eating rats, mice, shoe leather, and, according to chilling archaeological evidence and truly grim written reports, the corpses of their own dead. Out of a population of more than 250 settlers, a mere 60 skeletal survivors lived to see the spring. Then, against this backdrop of utter failure, one man, John Rolfe, had an idea. He figured out that a certain sweet strain of Caribbean tobacco, a highly desirable cash crop in Europe, was basically green gold. The effect was instantaneous and transformative. Suddenly, the same joint stock venture that had been shipping little more than corpses and letters of despair back to England was now shipping incredible profits. An entire colonial enterprise was saved, quite literally, by a smoke. By the year 1700, 13 distinct colonies lined the Atlantic coast like a string of mismatched, often argumentative puzzle pieces. In the rocky soil of Massachusetts, stern-faced Puritans were busy knitting a rigid, God-fearing theocracy, a city upon a hill intended to shine its light back on a corrupt old world. Further south, in Pennsylvania, pacifist Quakers led by William Penn were cutting handshake deals with native tribes, deals founded on principles of tolerance and a radical, for its time, notion of equality. And down in Virginia and the Carolinas, a wealthy planter class was growing ever more dependent on tobacco, rice, and indigo for burgeoning European markets, with slavery's shadow growing longer, deeper, and more brutal with every single harvest. For most of this long period, Great Britain was deeply preoccupied with its own expensive European turf wars with France and Spain, and as a result, it mostly ignored its colonial children across the Atlantic, a policy historians would later dub benign neglect. This hands-off approach, born not of kindness but of distraction, allowed local assemblies like Virginia's House of Burgesses to get very comfortable and very used to making their own rules, levying their own taxes and solving their own local problems. That powerful habit of self-reliance, of looking inward for governance, became deeply and irrevocably ingrained in the colonial DNA. After a long and globally costly struggle, Great Britain finally and decisively defeated its arch-rival France in the 7 Years' War, securing its vast North American empire. It celebrated this monumental victory by immediately realizing it had gone effectively broke in the process. To refill its depleted royal treasury, Parliament in London turned its gaze toward its increasingly prosperous colonies, and for the first time, decided to impose direct taxes. It slapped them with a series of deeply unpopular duties on things like sugar official documents via the Stamp Act and most famously tea, taxes that nobody in America had asked for, voted on, or consented to in any way. The colonists didn't just hate the price tag, they despised the principle behind it. They were utterly enraged by the precedent-setting idea that a distant government, an entire ocean away, in which they had no direct representative, could dictate the terms of their lives and their livelihoods. The Boston Tea Party was the explosive boiling point of this simmering resentment, a brazen and calculated act of political theater. Colonists, thinly disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 British ships and defiantly dumped 10,000 pounds worth of East India Company tea into the harbor. That's roughly $2 million in today's money. London's response was not negotiation or compromise, but overwhelming punishment. A raft of punitive measures the colonists immediately dubbed the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston's bustling port to all trade and effectively stripped Massachusetts of its long-cherished self-governance. For many, that was the final, unforgivable straw. The chaotic skirmishes at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 lit the fuse of open, armed rebellion. Soon after, Thomas Paine's radical pamphlet, Common Sense, flew off the printing presses, selling an incredible 120,000 copies in just 3 months. It transformed the abstract philosophical idea of independence into something that sounded urgent, necessary, and quite literally, like common sense for the common man. General George Washington, leading the newly formed Continental Army, famously lost more pitched battles than he won. But his true genius was not in battlefield tactics, but in sheer, stubborn perseverance. He held the ragged, starving, and often unpaid army together through brutal winters and demoralizing defeats, keeping the fragile spirit of the revolution alive long enough for crucial French naval ships and vital Dutch bank loans to tip the scales. In 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia, as the cornered British army surrendered, their military band symbolically played the tune "The World Turned Upside Down." The first attempt at a national government, the Articles of Confederation, tried to run the newly independent show, but produced a broke, toothless, and comically ineffective central authority, one that was unable even to put down a disgruntled farmers' revolt in Massachusetts known as Shays' Rebellion. So, in the sweltering summer of 1787, a group of delegates met in Philadelphia with the modest goal of simply tweaking the dysfunctional system, and ended up locking the doors, swearing themselves to secrecy, and inventing an entirely new one instead, the United States Constitution. As the first president under the new Constitution, George Washington set a profound and world-altering precedent when he voluntarily walked away from power after 2 terms. In a world of kings and emperors, this simple act established the revolutionary principle that presidents are public servants who hold temporary power, not monarchs who rule for life. His brilliant and ambitious Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton architected a controversial plan for a national bank to pull the fledgling country out of its crippling war debt. By having the federal government assume all the individual state debts, he created a unified national credit and bound the wealthy elite to the success of the national experiment. But this move also created deep philosophical divisions about the role and scope of government. This fundamental disagreement split the country into its first political parties: the Federalists, led by Hamilton, who favored a strong central government and a mercantile urban future, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who feared that such a government would inevitably favor wealthy urbanites over the common, virtuous farmer. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson, the champion of small government, seized a historic and somewhat hypocritical opportunity, snagging the entire Louisiana Territory from Napoleon's France for a mere $15 million. Napoleon needed quick cash for his endless European wars, and with a single stroke of a pen, the United States doubled in size overnight, gaining more elbow room than it possibly knew what to do with. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were dispatched to head west on their now legendary expedition. Every single mile of river and prairie they mapped for the young republic was another mile of land that native peoples, who had lived there for untold centuries, effectively lost claim to. The War of 1812 against Great Britain, sometimes called the Second War for Independence, ended in what was essentially a military shrug, a draw. Yet the conflict, which saw the White House burned and a stunning victory at New Orleans, birthed the Star-Spangled Banner and ignited a powerful, unifying wave of flag-waving nationalism. By the 1840s, the phrase "manifest destiny," coined by the journalist John O'Sullivan, rolled off American tongues like a divine promise from God himself. The widespread belief that the nation was providentially destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific fueled aggressive expansion into Texas, Oregon, and California. But each new star added to the flag, each new square mile of territory acquired, reignited the same toxic and increasingly urgent question: will this new territory permit the institution of slavery to come along for the ride? For decades, the only answer was to dangerously postpone the debate, kicking the can down the road with one shaky, fragile political compromise after another, until the lid on the boiling pot of sectional tension began to rattle violently, threatening to blow the entire nation apart. The stunning discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California in 1848 acted like a global magnet, sucking an estimated 300,000 dreamers, schemers, and fortune-seekers west in just 5 years, a frantic tidal wave of humanity. This frantic rush to add California to the Union as a free state threw the federal government into chaos, shattering the delicate balance of power. The Compromise of 1850 was a desperate, multi-part legislative gamble to keep the balance between free and slave states in the Senate. It succeeded only in buying a few more precious years of peace, not in brokering any kind of actual reconciliation, especially with its inclusion of a draconian new Fugitive Slave Act that forced Northerners to participate in the capture of escaped slaves, enraging abolitionists. Four years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 blew the issue wide open, establishing popular sovereignty and allowing settlers in the Western Territories to vote on whether to permit slavery themselves. This turned the rolling prairie into the grimly named Bleeding Kansas, a miniature undeclared civil war where pro-slavery and anti-slavery neighbors shot, hacked, and killed each other over the future of the territory. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court's infamous Dred Scott decision delivered a legal and moral bombshell. The court declared that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not and could never be citizens, and therefore had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This ruling honestly shredded any remaining legal hope for black citizenship and poured rhetorical gasoline on an already raging national fire. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a plain-spoken, self-taught lawyer from Illinois who had famously lost more elections than he'd won, captured the presidency without carrying a single Southern electoral vote. Seeing the writing on the wall and believing that Lincoln's victory spelled the inevitable doom of their slave-based economy and way of life, 11 Southern states, one by one, bolted from the Union. Four bloody, agonizing years and more than 600,000 graves later, the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse settled the argument with brutal, heartbreaking finality. In the war's aftermath, the 13th Amendment was passed and ratified, formally and forever erasing the institution of chattel slavery from American soil. The Union had survived its trial by fire, but it was now a nation stitched back together with deep, raw, and lasting scar tissue. The era that followed the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, was America's first, radical, and ultimately failed attempt at building a functional biracial democracy in the ashes of slavery. For a brief, hopeful, and truly revolutionary moment, it actually worked. Bolstered by the legal power of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to black men, formerly enslaved people voted in massive numbers, held public office from the local level all the way to the United States Congress, and built public schools for their children for the very first time. Then came the violent, organized, and terrifying backlash. The Ku Klux Klan was formed in Tennessee in 1865 as a social club for Confederate veterans, but it quickly evolved into a paramilitary terrorist organization. Its campaign of murder, intimidation, and terror against black citizens and their white Republican allies spread like a political cancer across the devastated South. By 1877, the political will in the North to continue the difficult and expensive project of Reconstruction had faded. As part of a dirty backroom deal to settle a contested presidential election, the federal troops who had been protecting the newly won rights of African Americans were ordered to march out of the South for good. A brutal system of state and local laws known collectively as Jim Crow immediately stepped into the power vacuum. These laws systematically erased most of the political and social gains made during Reconstruction, enforcing a rigid, humiliating, and violent system of racial segregation that would endure for nearly a century. While the South was wrestling with this bitter and tragic legacy, out west, the Transcontinental Railroad was stitching the continent together with iron rails, dynamite, and the grueling, often fatal labor of tens of thousands of Chinese and Irish immigrants. This period of westward expansion built the great legends of American folklore: the cowboys, the hard rock miners, the gunslingers, and the ruthless railroad tycoons. But for the native nations who already lived there, it was an era of relentless war, broken treaties, and systematic dispossession. A long trail of tears culminating in the 1890 massacre of Lakota men, women, and children by the United States Army at Wounded Knee Creek. That very same year, the United States Census Bureau officially declared the American frontier closed. The nation now stretched from sea to shining sea, yes, but whose sea it truly was, and for whom it was truly shining, was still very much up for grabs. During the so-called Gilded Age, America's steel mills and factories glowed like artificial suns 24 hours a day, churning out the raw material for a new, muscular industrial nation. Industrial titans, men with names like Andrew Carnegie in steel and John D. Rockefeller in oil, amassed personal fortunes so vast they could endow entire libraries, hospitals, and universities with what amounted to their spare change. During this same period, a staggering 20 million immigrants, mostly Italians, Jews and Poles from Southern and Eastern Europe, streamed through the chaotic processing gates of Ellis Island in New York Harbor. They profoundly and permanently changed the way American cities looked, sounded and smelled, providing the seemingly inexhaustible supply of cheap labor that fueled the unprecedented industrial boom. For some, factory wages, however meager, could eventually buy new modern marvels like phonographs and even Ford Model Ts. For most, however, those wages came at the terrible cost of punishing 12-hour shifts, incredibly dangerous and unregulated working conditions, and young children losing fingers or worse at textile looms and in coal mines. In response, a new breed of investigative journalists, derisively nicknamed the Muckrakers by their critics, began to expose the rot beneath the gilded surface. Figures like Ida Tarbell, who meticulously documented Rockefeller's predatory monopoly, and Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle revealed the horrifying and unsanitary realities of the Chicago meatpacking industry, began to yank the era's corruption and exploitation into the harsh light of day. Their exposés created a public outcry so loud and so persistent that Washington was forced to respond, creating landmark progressive-era reforms like the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Reserve System to regulate the banks, and the very first federal income tax. Abroad, the mysterious and still unexplained explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor became the pretext for America to jump into its first major imperial war against a fading Spanish empire. Almost overnight, and to the surprise of many Americans, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines became United States territories. A few years later, the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo spiraled into World War I, a conflict that dragged the country fully and, irrevocably, onto the world stage. The popular song over there became the nation's confident and jaunty soundtrack, but the grim reality was that 116,000 American soldiers never came back from the trenches of Europe. And back at home, after decades of marching, protesting, hunger strikes and imprisonment, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, giving women the right to vote, hard-won, irrefutable proof that enough sustained, organized pressure from ordinary citizens can, in fact, rewrite the Constitution itself. The 1920s roared. It was a decade of dizzying, intoxicating cultural explosion jazz music, born in the black communities of New Orleans, poured out of clubs in Chicago and New York, birthing a powerful cultural movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. Young women known as flappers defied generations of social norms with short hair, shorter hemlines, and a shocking new sense of independence. And all the while, the entire country engaged in a collective act of spectacular hypocrisy by ignoring that the nationwide prohibition on alcohol was directly fueling the rise of violent criminal empires like Al Capone's in Chicago. On paper, Wall Street soared to dizzying new heights, creating a shimmering, seductive fantasy of endless prosperity for all. In reality, a full 90% of Americans owned zero stocks, but the catastrophic stock market crash of October 1929 still managed to flatten everyone's future. The Great Depression followed, and it was a deep, collective national trauma unlike any other. Bread lines snaked around city blocks, and a staggering 25% unemployment rate felt like the new, bleak, and permanent normal. In the Great Plains, a terrible, years-long drought combined with decades of unsustainable farming practices created the Dust Bowl, an ecological catastrophe which literally blew the topsoil off of millions of acres of farmland, sending destitute families fleeing westward. Into this crisis stepped Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose New Deal fundamentally rewired the American social contract between the government and its citizens. A veritable blizzard of programs: Social Security, the federal minimum wage, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought electricity to the rural South, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put young men to work in national parks, formed an alphabet soup of government intervention that put millions of people back to work, and just as importantly, restored a fragile sense of national hope. While America was slowly and painfully climbing out of its economic hole, ambitious dictators in Europe and Asia were goose-stepping their nations into the global spotlight. For years, America, scarred by World War I, tried to remain staunchly isolated from the growing storm. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, the surprise attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan shattered that isolationism forever. From the scorching deserts of North Africa to the bloody beaches of Normandy, 16 million Americans served in the armed forces. The colossal war effort at home, which Roosevelt dubbed the Arsenal of Democracy, ended with two terrible mushroom clouds rising over two cities in Japan. America walked out of the rubble of World War II with half of the entire planet's industrial capacity under its control, a monopoly on the atomic bomb, and a brand new and very heavy superpower cape on its shoulders. After 1945, containment of global communism wasn't just a foreign policy, it was a complete worldview, a lens that shaped everything from national budgets to Hollywood movies. President Harry Truman sent money and military advisors to keep Greece and Turkey from falling to Soviet influence under what became known as the Truman Doctrine. He set out to rebuild a shattered Western Europe with the enormously successful Marshall Plan, and he faced down Joseph Stalin over the Soviet blockade of West Berlin with a daring, year-long airlift of food and supplies. The Korean War soon became the first major limited war of the atomic age, fought to a bloody, bitter draw that cost over 36,000 American lives, and honestly still divides the Korean peninsula to this day. Back at home, a new kind of American dream was being mass-produced in factories and sold to a war-weary public. Suburbs full of cookie-cutter houses sprouted like crabgrass across the American landscape, fueled by new highways and cheap mortgages. The GI Bill sent an entire generation of veterans to college and into the middle class, unless of course your skin wasn't white, as these life-changing benefits were systematically and often explicitly denied to black veterans. The Supreme Court's landmark, 1954 decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, toppled the long-standing legal fiction of separate but equal in public schools. A year later, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, sparking a citywide boycott and a non-violent movement that would change the nation. Marchers demanding basic voting rights crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and were brutally beaten by state troopers on national television. The shocking images forced a reluctant Congress to pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the powerful Voting Rights Act of 1965, monumental laws on paper, but, battles for dignity and equality that would still have to be fought in the streets year after year. All the while, the long, brutal, televised war in Vietnam tore the country apart at the seams, creating a bitter generation gap, and leaving 58,000 American names etched on a stark black granite wall in Washington, D.C. It was an era of incredible, jarring contrasts. In the summer of 1969, Neil Armstrong bounced on the surface of the moon, while at the very same time, 500,000 kids grooved in the mud at a music festival called Woodstock. The decade of turmoil ended with the Watergate scandal, a sordid political crisis that began with a third-rate burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and spiraled until it ended by proving that the Constitution's system of checks and balances still had teeth. President Richard Nixon flew away from the White House in disgrace, the first and only president ever to resign from office. The late 1970s were largely defined by a pervasive feeling of national malaise, a deep funk best captured by the miserable economic phenomenon of stagflation. the crippling, previously unheard-of combination of high inflation plus high unemployment that greeted every American at the gas station line and the grocery store. Into this widespread gloom strode Ronald Reagan, a former Hollywood actor and California governor who rode into the White House with a message of infectious morning in America optimism, deep tax cuts, sweeping deregulation, and a perpetually disarming grin. His policies, collectively dubbed Reaganomics, aimed to stimulate the economy by reducing the tax burden on producers, a theory of supply-side economics that promised prosperity would trickle down to everyone. As the 1980s progressed, the tectonic plates of the Cold War, which had defined global politics for 40 years, began to shift dramatically. The Berlin Wall, that ugly concrete and barbed wire symbol of the Iron Curtain, cracked open in November 1989 as jubilant crowds swarmed it with sledgehammers. Just 2 years later, the red hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the very last time. The Soviet Union was simply gone, dissolved into history. Suddenly, America stood as the world's lone undisputed hyperpower, with some prominent commentators declaring it was the end of history itself. Yet, this incredible triumph abroad was starkly contrasted by serious festering problems at home, as the crack cocaine epidemic, the terrifying AIDS crisis, and rapidly rising income inequality stalked the nation's cities. In 1991, the public internet blinked awake for the first time. By the year 2000, the speculative dot-com bubble that it fueled had popped like a cheap balloon, wiping out trillions of dollars in paper wealth virtually overnight. President Bill Clinton presided over a remarkable and sustained economic boom, successfully balanced the federal budget for the first time in decades, and survived a series of bruising political scandals that culminated in his impeachment by the House of Representatives. The century, and the millennium, ended with one of the most contentious and confusing elections in American history. Bush versus Gore, a razor-thin contest that was ultimately decided not by the voters, but by a controversial 5-4 Supreme Court decision that halted a recount in Florida and split the country like a bad divorce. The new century began with a profound, searing, and lasting shock when the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, turned a crisp, clear Tuesday morning into a lasting national nightmare broadcast live across the globe. The attacks plunged a wounded and furious nation into 2 long and costly wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, resulting in trillions of dollars spent, thousands of flag-draped coffins returning home, and the quiet creation of a vast new domestic and international national security apparatus. In 2008, a global financial crash, triggered by the collapse of a U.S. housing market built on a precarious foundation of risky subprime mortgages, vaporized 8.8 million American jobs, and nearly took the entire world economy down with it. The election of Barack Obama, the nation's first black president, rewrote history in real time. It was a moment of immense hope and global significance, yet the political polarization in the country, fueled by talk radio and the internet, only seemed to thicken and harden into bitter, unyielding tribalism. The explosion of smartphones put a supercomputer connected to all of human knowledge into every pocket, fundamentally rewiring our brains and transforming how we communicate, work, organize politically, and ultimately see each other. The last decade in particular has been a relentless whirlwind of history on fast forward, a global pandemic that shut down the world for over a year and claimed over 1 million American lives, massive social justice protests that filled the streets of nearly every city, and a violent insurrection at the U.S. Capitol that left everyone, across the political spectrum, asking if the Democratic center itself would hold. Now, in the present moment, America fiercely debates voting rights, climate action, and its own proper place in a rapidly changing world, trying to figure out what it means to lead, When a rival superpower like China is rising fast and old, post-war alliances seem to wobble. The great, complicated, and often contradictory American story is still being written, and the dramatic truth is that it's being written right now by all of us. From those 104 desperate, starving colonists huddled on a forgotten Virginia riverbank to a sprawling, complex, and deafeningly noisy nation of over 330 million citizens, the American story is messy, contradictory, frequently inspiring, and profoundly, stubbornly unfinished. It is a continuous, 400-year narrative of stretching borders and stretching imaginations, of astonishing technological marvels and staggering moral failings. It is a story of great promises kept and great promises broken, often in the very same breath and by the very same people. We have fought noble wars for freedom and brutal wars for land and treasure. We have built a society that offers unparalleled opportunity and innovation while simultaneously grappling with the persistent, poisonous legacies of deep-seated inequality. The fundamental question that every single generation of Americans faces, from the founders to the foot soldiers of the Civil War, from the civil rights marchers to the scientists who split the atom, is ultimately the same one we face today. What happens next? What does the next, as yet unwritten chapter of this epic story look like? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What part of this vast, sprawling story should we zoom into for our next deep dive? If this historical ride gave you a new lens on today's headlines and the world around you, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next journey into the stories that are still shaping our world.